I knew something was deeply wrong. The night I watched a crewmate wake up with someone else's memories. Down here, more than 2 miles beneath the surface, the walls feel thin, like the ocean is pressing its ear against us, listening to every breath we take. They gave me 11 rules on my first day. Strange ones, the kind that made me wonder what had happened to the researcher before me. I remember the first time I broke one of them, how the others stared at me like I'd already been claimed. I still don't know whether following the rules keeps us alive or keeps us trapped. I didn't understand why Rule 1, never fall asleep when someone else is already dreaming, mattered so much, until my first night inside the underwater lab, when the lights dimmed to their artificial dusk and the walls seemed to settle like a giant creature sinking deeper into the abyss. The room felt too quiet for a facility filled with 7 researchers, each of whom carried a tiredness that looked more like fear than exhaustion. I tried to pretend the rule was just some psychological precaution, a ritual to maintain alertness in a place where real daylight never came. But there was something in the way the veterans watched the sleeping bays that made it impossible to dismiss. It felt like they were waiting for something to happen, or trying to make sure it didn't. Hale had walked me through the lab earlier, his voice steady, but carrying the heavy restraint of someone who'd learned not to speak certain truths aloud. He said the rule wasn't superstition, wasn't metaphor, wasn't optional, and the way he emphasized that last part made the air around us thicken. He told me dreams behave differently at this depth, drifting into places the mind wasn't meant to reach, and that if 2 people fell asleep while dreaming overlapped, the overlap didn't always stay confined. His explanation made little sense to me at the time, but the seriousness in his eyes carved a warning into my thoughts. Down here, even unbelievable things gained credibility simply because there was no one to contradict them. My bunkmate, Elias, was already lying down when I came in, his eyes closed but muscles twitching subtly beneath the skin, as if responding to some internal pull. I watched him for a minute, hoping he'd notice me or acknowledge the shift of the mattress beneath my weight, but he remained locked in whatever dream held him. His breaths were uneven, drawn out, then sharply pulled in again, as though something inside the dream was controlling the rhythm. I shouldn't have stared as long as I did, but something about the pattern mesmerized me, almost like it was calling for sync. Only when my eyelids grew heavier than they should have did I snap out of it, forcing myself upright before the fatigue could drag me down with him. The pressure outside the walls always hummed faintly, a sound you only notice when the rest of the facility goes still. That night it felt louder, as if the ocean itself was leaning toward us, curious about which of us would be the next to drift off. I couldn't shake the uneasy idea that the ocean wanted us asleep, wanted our minds softened and open. When I mentioned this feeling to Hale during evening checks, he didn't dismiss it. Instead, he said he'd once thought the same thing, back when he was new, before he learned that the danger didn't come from the ocean directly, but from something older that moved within it. He stopped himself before explaining further. Hale always stopped himself just before saying the part that mattered most. Later during the night shift briefing, I noticed how the others positioned themselves so they could see the sleeping quarters without appearing obvious. They sat with stiff posture, shoulders angled toward the hallway where the bunks were. No one said it aloud, but they were monitoring breathing patterns, murmurs, shifts under blankets. It wasn't concern, it was caution. I asked a technician named Lorne whether people talked in their sleep often, and he answered only with a glance toward the bunk area, as though he expected voices to drift out at any moment. His silence was more explanation than words could offer. It made the place feel less like a research station and more like a quarantine ward. When I returned to my own room, Elias was whispering something under his breath, words too faint to form meaning. His lips moved as if speaking to someone far away, someone he expected to answer. I stood at the doorway, torn between shaking him awake and backing away. Hale had said not to disturb sleepers unless there was an emergency, but he never defined emergency clearly. Watching Elias whisper to someone unseen felt like it should qualify, yet fear rooted me in place. It wasn't fear of him, it was fear of what waking him might reveal. Down here dreams weren't private, they were shared spaces you weren't meant to step into. The shadows in the corners of the room, always stretched strangely during low-power hours, bending just slightly more than the light allowed. They seemed to reach toward Elias's bunk that night, as if drawn by the movement of his dreaming mind. I couldn't stop staring at that subtle stretching, at the slow breathing that kept trying to lull me into matching its rhythm. Something instinctive told me that if I let myself drift even a little, I would fall into the same dream he was trapped in. The thought of that not knowing what waited inside his mind snapped the drowsiness right out of me. Staying awake became less a rule and more a survival instinct. I tried distracting myself by checking the equipment storage logs, but even the tablet screen seemed dimmer than usual, as if the artificial lights themselves were losing interest in staying awake. Every few minutes, I looked over at Elias, making sure his twitching hadn't grown more violent. At one point his hand rose as though reaching for something above him, though his eyes remained closed. I stepped closer, unsure whether he was waking, but then his breathing changed again, deepening into a pattern too slow to feel normal. I whispered his name, but he didn't stir. The dream held him too tightly. The air around his bunk felt colder than the rest of the room, like something had settled there with him. I felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in, my thoughts slowing, vision blurring slightly at the edges. I knew I shouldn't lie down, not even for a moment, but fatigue at this depth feels unnatural, more like a force than a feeling. I gripped the railing of my bunk, grounding myself, focusing on the subtle vibration that ran through the metal. It reminded me that I was awake, tethered to reality. Still, the longer I remained there, the more I sensed something shifting from Elias's direction, an almost imperceptible pressure that made the air around me thicken. I don't know why, but I felt like he wasn't the only one dreaming anymore. The floor beneath my feet felt warmer than it had earlier, and the faint circular patches of condensation on the walls grew larger, as if reacting to something unseen. I stepped away from Elias and leaned against the far wall, forcing deep breaths to stay lucid. I didn't dare close my eyes, not even to blink for too long. The room was too still, too watchful. I had the unsettling sense that if I let myself relax for even a second, my mind would be pulled somewhere I couldn't return from. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone or something to walk in. What finally snapped me fully alert wasn't a sound, but a subtle shift in Elias's expression. His face softened, then tightened, as though reacting to something only he could see. Then his lips moved again, forming words I couldn't hear, but this time his head turned slightly toward me, as if acknowledging my presence from inside his dream. My heart pounded, but I stayed still. I had no idea whether waking him would break something or unleash it. All I knew was that he wasn't alone in his dream anymore, and neither was I. When his eyes suddenly opened, they didn't look at me with recognition. They looked through me, as though seeing something behind me, something I couldn't sense. His breathing steadied, and he whispered a single phrase that made the entire lab feel smaller, tighter, and impossibly cold. "Did you hear it come in?" I could feel the lingering tension from Rule 1 still crawling up my spine when I remembered Rule 2. No one opens a door after 3 o'clock hours, no matter who is knocking. The first time the knocking started, it was soft, deliberate, impossibly timed, echoing through the narrow corridors of the lab, like the walls themselves were communicating. I had stayed awake beside Elias, watching him breathe steadily, terrified of what his dream might have become, when the sound came again, closer, synchronized with each thump of my own heart. My fingers trembled on the metal railing outside my bunk as logic and instinct battled. Every part of me screamed to move, yet another part warned that moving meant crossing the boundary the rule had set. Even in the dim blue light, I could see the shadows stretching unnaturally along the corridor, as if reacting to the unseen presence beyond the door. That night, the rule didn't feel like guidance. It felt like a lifeline suspended by invisible threads. The knocking persisted, slow and methodical, sometimes curling upward, sometimes scraping along the panels as though testing every seam in the door for weakness. I wondered if the others could hear it, or if it existed only in the spaces of my mind stretched thin by isolation and pressure. Hale had warned me that noises at this depth were deceptive, capable of bending through the thick walls and arriving in unexpected places. But these knocks carried intention, awareness. My legs shook as I realized that the moment I considered opening the door, I had already violated a threshold. Standing frozen, I imagined what might be behind that simple metal panel. Another researcher who had lost their grip on reality, or something far older, something that had learned how to mimic human patience. Elias shifted beside me, eyes closed, still whispering fragments of dreams I couldn't comprehend. I knew that Rule 2 wasn't just about doors, it was about timing, about moments when our boundaries were thinnest, when the abyss could reach inside and test our vigilance. The earlier rule about not sleeping near another dreamer suddenly intertwined with this one. The corridors were extensions of the sleeping mind, and if a door opened at the wrong hour, a mind could step out into another mind, or worse, into a waiting presence that had nothing human to do with it. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the steady blinking of the emergency light above, but even the small pulse of light felt like it was synchronized with something else, something outside myself, something patient. I debated retreating to my bunk, letting the knocks pass, but instinct told me to keep watching. Each pause in the knocking was worse than the knocks themselves, because the silence carried intent, the way the ocean presses on the hull in uneven rhythms, hinting at something deeper beneath. I walked slowly along the corridor, counting steps, focusing on the tactile sensation of the floor under my boots, reminding myself I was alive and awake. At one point, I glanced at the adjacent doors where other researchers' bunks lay, imagining them asleep, dreaming, vulnerable to what waited just beyond the wood and metal of their sanctuaries. I felt a shiver, though the air was still, because I understood that the rule wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, a network of fragile minds tethered to the station by thin strands of awareness. Minutes dragged into hours, though the clock on the wall indicated barely 10 minutes had passed. I kept hearing subtle shifts in the metal, faint creaks from places I knew should have been stable, and I imagined Elias stirring slightly beside me, his body responding subconsciously to the presence outside. I considered speaking, calling to him, but Hale's words about rules were still ringing in my ears. The rules protect you from more than the ocean, he had said. They protect you from each other, and from what waits in the gaps. That phrase returned repeatedly to my mind as I watched the door, every nerve screaming, every sense hyper-aware. I could feel my heartbeat, my breath, the pull of the abyss pressing invisibly against the thin walls of the lab. By the time the first hour of 3 o'clock passed, the knocks had intensified, not in speed, but in certainty, like someone or something knew that I was awake and testing my resolve. I crouched low, hands gripping the railing, fighting the natural urge to open the door, to see what or who had waited so patiently. The light flickered again, shadows folding over themselves, stretching toward the doorway as though the walls themselves had learned the pattern of our fear. It was in that moment I realized that the rules weren't arbitrary. They were reminders of thresholds, checkpoints in a system of survival designed by people who had experienced the consequences of failure firsthand. Every echo, every vibration in the walls was a test. Could I endure until the moment passed? Hours seemed to meld into a single elongated moment, the kind that makes consciousness fragile and perception unreliable. I counted my own breathing, forced myself to stay rigid, and tried to remember the mundane tasks I had left unfinished, anything to anchor myself to reality. Yet even the smallest movements made the knocking respond, sometimes quicker, sometimes longer, as if testing me, drawing attention to my presence. I thought back to previous nights, when lights had flickered for no apparent reason, machines had misbehaved, and staff whispered about shadows that didn't belong. Each instance now carried more weight. Each previous warning from Hale suddenly felt like a prediction rather than advice. The door, the corridor, the distant hum of the ocean beyond, they all conspired to remind me that breaking Rule 2 could mean crossing a line I didn't yet understand. Finally, when the hands of the clock passed the critical hour, the knocking stopped, but the absence of sound was worse than its presence. The corridor felt denser, heavier, as though the air itself had learned what I feared most. I didn't dare move until the emergency lights blinked in their slow, regular pattern, signaling the end of the window I had survived. My muscles ached from holding position. My mind was drained yet hyper-alert. I returned to my bunk, heart still hammering, knowing the night wasn't over. I couldn't shake the sense that eyes, unseen, patient, waiting, had been watching, and that Rule 2 had not just been about protecting me, but about maintaining some fragile boundary that kept everything we couldn't name safely outside. I woke Elias with a gentle shake, careful not to speak too loudly. His eyes fluttered open, vacant at first, then focused, registering fear without understanding why. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him nothing, saying only that the corridor was empty. But both of us knew better. Even with the knocks gone, the knowledge remained. Some presences here didn't respect walls or doors, only moments and boundaries. And I realized that Rule 2 wasn't just a guideline for obedience. It was a reminder that control was an illusion, and survival depended on keeping your mind sharp, your body alert, and your instincts unquestioned. By the time dawn, or what we called dawn in the lab's artificial cycle, arrived, I felt the first genuine exhaustion of my stay, though I hadn't slept. The corridor was silent, the shadows retreating, yet the feeling of being observed lingered like a second skin. I wondered how many nights other researchers had survived with the same awareness, how many had learned the hard way what it meant to break Rule 2. I didn't yet have the answer, but I knew one thing for certain: breaking the rule had consequences that stretched far beyond the immediate moment, into dreams, corridors, and perhaps something deeper in the ocean that even Hale refused to name. The next morning, Hale didn't ask about the knocks, and I didn't volunteer. He only reminded me that the rules weren't arbitrary, that some boundaries were meant to protect us from more than just accidents or mistakes. As I prepared for my first full shift, the memory of the knocks haunted me, each echo a reminder of the thin line between safety and something I couldn't yet comprehend. And I knew deep down that Rule 2 had tested me, not just my vigilance, but my ability to survive the invisible, patient presence that waited for any lapse in attention. Even after surviving the knocking outside the corridor, I couldn't shake the lingering dread when I remembered Rule 3. Never speak to anyone who hasn't fully opened their eyes. The warning seemed simple at first, almost childish, but the depth of the lab made it feel deadly serious. On my way to the observation deck, I passed several researchers, some staring off into nothing with half-lidded eyes, murmuring words that made no sense. I hesitated, feeling an instinctive pull to greet them, to break the silence. But Hale's instructions flashed in my mind. If their eyes aren't open, they're not truly present. That alone had kept me alive more than once. And yet the compulsion to interact, to anchor myself to normalcy, gnawed at me like hunger. The deeper the lab's corridors stretched, the more obvious it became that those who hadn't opened their eyes weren't idle. They were drifting in a liminal state, between wakefulness and dream, tethered partly to reality, partly to something else. I remembered how Elias had slept that first night, whispering words from his dream, and I realized Rule 3 was connected, a continuation of the vigilance the first two rules demanded. Any careless conversation could draw attention from whatever lingered in the half-conscious mind, and the older researcher's warning was clear. Words have weight in this place, and speaking to someone who isn't fully aware could invite consequences that you couldn't predict or control. That morning, I passed Lorne in the hallway. His eyes were half shut, glazed over in a way that made it difficult to tell if he was awake. I stopped, debating whether to call his name or to walk past silently. Something in the back of my mind screamed at me to move on, but my instincts wanted reassurance, wanted confirmation that he was safe. I swallowed the urge and kept walking, feeling the metal floor vibrate slightly under my boots. The hum of the lab's machinery seemed louder than normal, almost synchronized with my racing heart. I had learned that even subtle sounds could carry meaning here, and every vibration could mark attention from minds that weren't entirely human. By mid-shift, the tension had only grown. I noticed more people wandering the corridors with their eyes unfocused, muttering under their breath, or gesturing to empty space. The place seemed alive in ways I had never imagined, as if the walls themselves were aware of who was speaking and who remained silent. I reminded myself of Rule 3 constantly, forcing each interaction to be cautious, each greeting to be withheld until full engagement. I felt a pressure building, like invisible threads, connecting partially awake minds to something ancient lurking beneath the ocean's crushing weight. Every glance towards someone whose eyes weren't fully open sent a jolt through me, a warning encoded in instinct and experience. Lunch in the central lab brought its own tension. Researchers moved quietly, barely acknowledging one another. The half-awake faces were everywhere, creating a maze of uncertainty that made it difficult to relax. I caught Elias watching me from across the room, eyes open, alert, yet there was an unease in his expression that I couldn't place. I considered asking him about the other researchers, but then remembered Rule 3. Speaking unnecessarily could expose both of us to the consequences. Instead, I kept my focus on the task at hand, carefully handling samples, checking equipment, maintaining an awareness of everything and everyone around me. The weight of unspoken rules felt heavier than the pressurized walls enclosing us. After the meal, I returned to the observation deck, where the ocean outside seemed darker than usual. The water's pressure and depth created an almost tactile presence, a constant reminder that the lab existed inside an alien world. I glanced down the corridors and noticed a new researcher, pale and trembling, wandering toward the sleeping bays with their eyes half-lidded. I wanted to call out, to warn them to stay still, but I froze, remembering Rule 3. Speaking to them in their current state might draw attention from whatever haunted the liminal spaces between consciousness and dreams. I realized then that the rules weren't arbitrary. They were protections for moments when the ordinary human mind becomes vulnerable in extraordinary circumstances. During the late shift, the lights flickered slightly, creating moving shadows across the walls. I could sense the faint movements of several researchers, eyes half open, drifting like ghosts tethered to their own minds. I passed one who muttered a phrase I couldn't understand, and another who raised a hand as though reaching for someone who wasn't there. The depth of this place warps perception, warps the mind, and I understood why Hale had insisted on Rule 3. To speak to them carelessly was to risk their influence extending beyond the threshold of sleep, potentially affecting my mind as well. Every cautious step, every measured breath, became a negotiation with forces I could barely comprehend. Elias eventually joined me on the deck, fully alert and whispering a warning. "They're moving differently today," he said, his eyes scanning the shadows. I nodded, careful not to respond too loudly, mindful of Rule 3. He understood, even without needing me to speak the rule aloud, that partial consciousness wasn't just a state, it was a vulnerability, a breach in the defenses that kept us sane. We worked together quietly, documenting the anomaly, observing movements that no one outside the lab would ever believe. Every researcher whose eyes weren't fully open became a potential threat, a loose node in a network of attention that extended beyond the ordinary human perception. By the end of my shift, exhaustion began to press at the edges of my awareness, and I had to remind myself constantly to stay fully awake. The half-conscious researchers wandered past, their eyes flickering like incomplete circuits, a subtle but dangerous presence. I realized that Rule 3 wasn't just about conversation, it was about focus, awareness, and the delicate balance of mind and body in a place where isolation magnifies every lapse. I felt the depth and weight of the ocean more acutely than ever, sensing that any misstep could ripple outward in ways impossible to reverse. The final moments before the night cycle felt longer than any time I had ever experienced. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the faint hum of machinery became a constant, almost musical warning that the environment was alive with observation. I noticed several researchers clustered near the outer panels, eyes only half open, hands reaching for controls they didn't fully understand. I knew that breaking Rule 3, even once, in this place, could allow something unseen to slip through the cracks. And in that moment I finally understood the terrifying interconnection of all the rules, the sequence of vigilance, awareness, and patience that preserved life in a world that didn't forgive carelessness. When I finally returned to my bunk, fully alert but drained, I looked at Elias and whispered, careful not to violate the rule. We made it through tonight. He nodded, eyes wide, fully awake, and I realized the phrase didn't matter. It was the shared awareness that counted. Down here, Rule 3 had taught me something I couldn't have anticipated. Survival was not about bravery or skill. It was about understanding the boundaries between consciousness and dream, between what is seen and what is only perceived, and respecting the fragile line that separated safety from the unknown. The corridor was empty, the shadows retreating, yet the weight of the half-awake minds lingered like a presence waiting for me to falter. Even after surviving the half-conscious researchers of Rule 3, I couldn't shake the lingering anxiety. As I remembered Rule 4, never enter the observation chamber alone during a power fluctuation. I had been warned multiple times, but nothing could prepare me for the first time the warning became reality. The corridor lights dimmed unexpectedly, shadows twisting and stretching along the walls like living tendrils, and my stomach clenched as I realized the observation chamber's automated doors had partially closed behind me. Every instinct screamed not to go inside, not alone, but curiosity and responsibility collided. I had to check the data from the deep-sea sensors. They were showing anomalies, subtle shifts in pressure and light that could indicate equipment malfunction, or worse. The moment I stepped into the chamber, I felt the full weight of the rule pressing down. The faint hum of the lab's generators fluctuated with the failing lights, creating a sense of movement that wasn't visible. Instruments beeped irregularly, their readings jittering as if responding to something unseen. I reminded myself to stay calm, repeating the rule silently: never enter alone during a power fluctuation. The ocean outside pressed against the thick glass with its usual oppressive force, but tonight it felt closer, more aware. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, reacting to my every step, and I realized that the combination of isolation, darkness, and deep pressure made even small mistakes far more dangerous than they seemed. My hands shook slightly as I reached for the sensor console, trying to focus on the task at hand without letting my imagination spiral. I remembered Hale's warning from orientation. The observation chamber is a place where the mind can wander dangerously, especially when the power fluctuates. Sensors can malfunction, readings can become indecipherable, and perception itself can betray you. At first I thought he exaggerated, but walking alone now, in the dim emergency lighting, I understood. The chamber seemed alive, the shadows almost tactile. I moved cautiously between consoles, careful not to knock anything over or step into areas where shadows pooled unnaturally. Even the small vibration of my boots against the metal floor felt magnified, echoing in the chamber, as if amplified by unseen forces waiting for a lapse in attention. Each step reminded me that the rule was not a suggestion, it was survival. As I began examining the deep-sea sensor logs, I noticed subtle distortions in the images projected on the display screens. Faint, almost imperceptible forms moved behind the regular patterns, shapes that should not have been there. I leaned closer, trying to understand the anomaly, and a sudden shift in lighting made the forms appear closer, sharper, more deliberate. I froze. The chamber felt smaller, walls pressing in, and I realized I could not see the whole space at once. Even with my focus on the monitors, peripheral shadows moved independently, suggesting presence. I forced myself to remember Rule 4, repeating it like a mantra, knowing the danger lay in my isolation, my vulnerability to mistakes and illusions alike. I tried contacting Alias via intercom, knowing the rule emphasized never being alone, but the fluctuating power caused static to dominate the channel. His voice came through only in fragments, unintelligible phrases that made the chamber feel more alien, more isolated. I shouted, but the echoes carried only my own voice back, warped and hollow. I realized that power fluctuations weren't just technical issues, they amplified everything: fear, perception, vulnerability. My pulse quickened, and I felt the creeping sensation of being observed, though no one else was present. The shadows seemed to lean closer, responding to my tension, making every movement a negotiation with the unknown forces at play. I had no choice but to stay put and maintain control, knowing any misstep could be catastrophic. Minutes stretched into hours, or what felt like hours. The flickering lights created a rhythm, a pulsing awareness in the chamber that made it feel alive, responsive, almost sentient. I moved carefully between consoles, my every action deliberate. As I tried to analyze sensor data, I noticed small anomalies creeping into the readings, tiny patterns that shouldn't have been there, as if something was interacting with the instruments without physical presence. I thought back to previous nights, the half-awake researchers, the knocks in the corridor, the shadows pressing in subtly. This was the logical continuation of the rules, a trial I was now subjected to personally. Rule 4 wasn't just about electrical safety, it was about maintaining a tether to reality in the face of forces that sought to sever it. I started tracing each anomaly, trying to differentiate between equipment malfunction and external influence. Every movement caused a subtle vibration through the chamber, reflected in the sensors as minor disturbances that seemed almost intentional. The ocean outside remained motionless in appearance, yet I felt it leaning in, reacting. I considered retreating to the main corridor, but remembered the rule and the consequences of violating it. Alone, with partial power, the chamber was more dangerous than anything I had encountered before. Shadows shifted slightly as I adjusted my position, the walls no longer inert metal, but an environment aware of me, responding to my every choice. At one point, I saw something move in the corner of my vision, an elongated shadow that didn't match any physical object. I froze, remembering Rule 4, realizing I had to maintain control, keep my breathing steady, and avoid reacting too quickly. Any sudden motion could provoke unknown consequences. The shadows seemed to ripple, to stretch toward me, yet whenever I turned to confront them directly, nothing was there. My pulse raced, but I reminded myself that the rule existed for moments like this, to enforce caution when fear could override reason. Step by careful step, I returned to the main console, continuing my work, silently pleading for the lights to stabilize. The power continued its erratic fluctuations, and each flicker brought new challenges. I realized that the observation chamber amplified not only mechanical faults, but also mental strain. My senses felt sharper, every sound, every reflection heightened. I imagined Elias standing nearby, watching, the rule echoing in my mind, warning me of the consequences of isolation. I moved methodically, documenting everything, ensuring no mistakes. Every shadow that seemed to linger in the corner became a test of focus, a trial that demanded adherence to Rule 4, reminding me that survival depended not on strength, but on awareness, discipline, and respect for the limitations imposed by this environment. Hours passed, though it was impossible to measure exactly how long. The fluctuation of lights and the deep hum of the lab's machinery made time feel irrelevant. I maintained my vigil at the console, recording anomalies, observing shadows, ensuring nothing disturbed the delicate balance that kept the lab functioning. The isolation pressed in on me, yet the rule's guidance provided a framework for action, a lifeline through the growing tension. I understood finally that Rule 4 was less about technical safety and more about maintaining clarity, composure, and sanity in an environment that sought to undermine both. Eventually, the lights stabilized enough for me to safely leave the observation chamber. The moment I stepped into the corridor, I felt a shift, as if the tension trapped inside had released a pulse through the walls. Elias met me at the far end, eyes fully open, steady, and without a word. We knew the trial had passed, yet the weight of the experience lingered. Rule 4 had not just protected me physically, it had reinforced the fragile balance of awareness and survival, a balance that the ocean's pressure, the isolation, and the unknown entities relied upon our discipline to maintain. I knew that future nights would test me in even stranger ways, and the rules were the only tether keeping us connected to reality. After surviving the observation chamber during the power fluctuations, the next rule weighed on me almost immediately. Rule 5. Never adjust the pressure controls without a second person present. I remembered the explanation Hale had given during orientation. Pressure in the lab was a delicate balance, yes, but the danger wasn't just mechanical. Any solitary adjustment could amplify instability in ways that drew attention from something else. Something the ocean seemed to know was vulnerable. I was alone in the engineering bay that night, the hum of the compressors loud in the narrow room, and the dim lights casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. My hands hovered over the control panel, frozen by the awareness that the smallest miscalculation could trigger consequences far beyond the lab's integrity. The bay smelled faintly of metal and coolant, a scent that reminded me I was in a living, breathing machine far beneath miles of water. I traced the dials carefully, checking for irregularities, my eyes scanning every gauge and pressure reading for signs of deviation. The deeper the ocean pressed on the hull, the more aware I became that the environment itself wasn't passive. It reacted to our actions, to our errors. The rule wasn't about safety alone. It was about preventing the lab from becoming an amplifier for forces we couldn't see. Even in my cautious approach, every slight adjustment felt like it might echo through the hallways, through the air, and perhaps beyond, reaching parts of the lab and of the ocean that shouldn't be disturbed. I thought about the last crew who had disobeyed Rule 5. Though details were scarce and fragmented, rumors circulated, fragments of logs missing, personnel transferred without explanation. The consequences weren't mechanical failure alone. Those who tampered alone reported strange occurrences, vivid hallucinations, unexplained shadows, dreams that lingered long after sleep. I realized the rule had been framed in technical terms to hide its true purpose: protection from the unknown. I touched the valve lightly, then withdrew my hand, reminding myself that this was a trial of patience and restraint. The compressors thrummed louder, as if sensing my hesitation, the pressure inside the chamber responding subtly, rhythmically, almost sentiently. I considered calling Elias, but the intercom was quiet, and he was resting in the far module. Communication had to be precise. A careless word could draw the attention of things that moved between awareness and dream. I paced slowly, tracing the edge of the bay, counting steps, focusing on the tactile feel of the floor beneath my boots to anchor myself. The controls loomed before me, familiar yet intimidating, and I understood finally why the rule emphasized a second person. Not merely for backup, but as a safeguard against something older, something patient, something waiting for a lapse in judgment, or a solitary action to cross a boundary it could exploit. I began reviewing the sensor logs from the past shifts, tracing pressure fluctuations that had seemed minor at first. There were inconsistencies, subtle deviations that didn't match any mechanical explanation. I realized that even observation without adjustment might be enough to influence whatever presence lingered within the lab. The ocean outside pressed against the walls in a slow, constant rhythm, and I imagined it listening, noting my hesitation. Shadows flickered along the consoles, and I convinced myself it was only the light. Yet instinct, honed by the earlier rules and experiences, told me otherwise. Every solitary breath, every step, every movement had the potential to trigger a response from the unknown. The tension escalated as I approached the main control panel again. I considered testing a minor adjustment, just enough to see whether the readings would normalize. My fingers hovered above the switch, my mind recalling every warning from Hale. The last person who ignored the rule had not returned to their bunk the same way. Hesitation and calculation warred in me. I forced myself to wait, tracing patterns on the metal console with my fingertips to maintain tactile awareness. The compressor's low hum grew in resonance, almost like a heartbeat, synchronizing with my own pulse. Isolation amplified everything, made every risk feel magnified, and I understood that the rule's power lay as much in psychological control as in technical necessity. Hours seemed to pass in a haze of careful observation and deliberate inaction. The shadows in the bay stretched and folded unnaturally, reminding me that I was alone and fully exposed. I felt the ocean's presence beyond the thick metal walls, the constant weight pressing inward, listening, reacting. I moved slowly from one end of the chamber to the other, checking gauges, noting temperatures, and tracing every reading meticulously. Each movement reinforced my awareness of Rule 5 and my fragile grasp on stability. Any adjustment made alone might be amplified by forces beyond comprehension, and I didn't dare test them. A faint sound like a vibration in the hull drew my attention to the far side of the bay. I froze, heart thundering, imagining what might be there. The lights flickered in subtle rhythm, shadows distorting unnaturally, responding to my gaze. I whispered to myself, recalling Rule 5, reminding myself why patience and caution were not just protocol, but survival. The unknown forces that haunted the lab seemed to feed on solitary actions, on mistakes made in isolation. I clenched my fists, grounding myself, and focused solely on observation, maintaining vigilance over every instrument and panel. No adjustment would be made until I had another pair of eyes present. Eventually, the intercom crackled faintly, and Elias's voice came through, steady and calm. Relief washed over me, and I knew the rule had fulfilled its purpose. I could now safely make minor adjustments, knowing a witness could help anchor both our awareness. The presence in the shadows seemed to recede slightly, the chamber returning to its familiar mechanical rhythm. Even with Elias beside me, though, the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant reminder that the ocean and the lab were more than just physical structures. They were environments that responded to intent, to action, to isolation. The rules weren't merely guidelines, they were survival tools, keeping us tethered to reality and sanity. By the end of the night shift, all readings had stabilized. Elias and I documented the anomalies carefully, making notes that would help future shifts. The presence of a second person had allowed me to adhere fully to Rule 5, ensuring that no solitary mistake triggered consequences beyond our comprehension. The lab felt quieter, though the pressure of the deep sea remained, omnipresent and weighty. I realized that Rule 5 was as much about discipline and restraint as technical safety, and that our survival depended on observing it without exception. The lessons of isolation had become starkly clear. When I finally returned to the sleeping quarters, the fatigue I had fought against all night hit me in waves. I glanced at Elias, who gave me a faint nod, eyes fully open and alert, and I understood the quiet reinforcement of the rules. Down here in a world where the ocean pressed constantly against steel walls, Rule 5 had reminded me that our isolation could be exploited. Survival wasn't just about strength, endurance, or technical skill. It was about respect, timing, and careful adherence to the rules. Any lapse could carry consequences that the deep sea itself might witness, or worse, amplify in ways we could never fully understand. Even after surviving the pressure controls incident, I couldn't shake the lingering anxiety when I remembered Rule 6. Never leave the lab modules without securing the emergency lifeline. The emergency lifeline wasn't just a rope or a tether. It was a fragile thread connecting us to safety, to sanity, to the controlled environment we called home beneath miles of ocean. I had ignored it once in training, thinking the corridors were short and safe, and the instructors had warned me with quiet severity that the lifeline's absence invited consequences far beyond minor injury. That night, I walked toward the external access hatch, the metallic walls humming under the ocean's relentless pressure, shadows folding unnaturally along the corridors, and the knowledge of Rule 6 pressed on my mind like a physical weight. The ocean outside the lab modules was a constant presence, not passive, not silent, but alive in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Currents shifted, pressure fluctuated, and the dim emergency lights flickered with a rhythm that felt calculated rather than random. I secured the lifeline, wrapping it around the steel anchor points with trembling hands, acutely aware that any lapse in diligence could draw attention from something waiting just beyond the walls. The older researchers had warned me in hushed tones about the consequences of ignoring the rule. Those who ventured out unprotected, often returned altered, hollow, or not at all. Each knot I tied, each tension check I performed, was reinforced with the unspoken understanding that the abyss itself might be watching, learning, and punishing carelessness. I stepped into the module corridor, lifeline taut, every sense alert. Shadows stretched and merged along the walls, reacting subtly to my presence. The emergency lights flickered again, and I thought I saw forms moving beyond the glass panels, just at the edge of perception. I reminded myself silently of Rule 6, anchoring my mind to its significance. The lifeline wasn't merely a safety tool, it was a psychological tether, maintaining connection between the conscious self and the fragile stability of the lab's modules. Each careful step reinforced discipline, reminding me that the ocean and its unseen residents demanded respect, vigilance, and adherence to the rules we often whispered, but never questioned. The corridors leading to the outer modules seemed longer than usual, stretched by the eerie stillness and the occasional hum of distant machinery. I felt the faint vibrations through the floor, resonating with my heartbeat, and every step carried amplified awareness. My thoughts drifted briefly to the previous incidents, the knocks in the hall, the half-conscious researchers, and the observation chamber. Each rule had been a preparation for this moment. Rule 6 emphasized a tangible connection, yet the real danger was intangible. The ocean's patient presence, the subtle distortions of perception, and the quiet testing of our resolve. I moved deliberately, eyes scanning the edges of shadows, noting reflections, and imagining the abyss pressing just beyond the glass walls. When I reached the access hatch, I hesitated before opening it. The emergency lights inside the module corridor flickered again, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like arms. I gripped the lifeline, a fragile connection to safety, and recalled Hale's exact words: "The lifeline is more than steel and fiber. It's a boundary between what we understand and what waits beyond. Never step without it." The hatch loomed, and the water outside pressed against the thick glass, a silent, omnipresent force. Every instinct urged caution, reminding me that even with the lifeline, the margin for error was minuscule. I took a deep breath, focusing on securing myself completely before any movement, feeling the tautness of the line anchor me as if it were an extension of my own will. I began checking the exterior sensors from the hatch, careful not to step beyond the tether's reach. Currents brushed the outer hull, and tiny bubbles floated past in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like signals or warnings. I wondered if the ocean itself had awareness, monitoring our adherence to the rules, rewarding patience, and punishing recklessness. Rule 6 reinforced the connection between action and consequence, a principle that became clearer with every careful adjustment and every calculated movement. Even the smallest mistake, a slip, a release of tension, a misstep, could have drawn forces beyond comprehension into the lab's environment, making survival dependent on precision, awareness, and adherence. The tension in the corridors escalated as I moved from one external panel to the next. I felt the faint pressure changes through my boots, a subtle vibration transmitted through the metal floors, and I reminded myself that the emergency lifeline was my only physical tether to certainty. Shadows along the walls shifted unnaturally, stretching as if reaching for the tether, yet I held my grip, repeating the rules silently. Each careful check of the sensors, each adjustment to the external panel, reinforced the rule's importance. It wasn't enough to know the procedure. I had to respect the lifeline as a conduit to safety, a barrier against consequences that were subtle, patient, and potentially fatal. I paused to consider the other researchers, imagining the mistakes they might have made, the times they ignored the rule or took shortcuts. Rumors haunted these modules, tales of people who had ventured out unprepared, who had returned silent, altered, or never at all. The stories weren't just superstition, they were warnings encoded in the very architecture of the lab, in the procedures we followed, and in the rules we had been drilled to memorize. Rule 6 emphasized redundancy, partnership, and connection, a reinforcement against isolation and hubris. I realized fully how fragile our existence was in this environment, and how dependent we were on the discipline and caution that rules like this enforced. Minutes passed, though the sensation of time was warped by the isolation and the deep pressure pressing on the hull. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, performed with the knowledge that the lifeline was not just a tool, but a guardian. Shadows seemed to shift in response to my focus, and I felt the silent presence of the ocean watching, testing, waiting. Rule 6 demanded attention to both tangible and intangible threats, and I obeyed meticulously, feeling the line's tension vibrate subtly with each step. The psychological weight of the rule was as significant as the physical safety it ensured, a constant reminder that isolation beneath the ocean was far more dangerous than it seemed. Eventually, the inspection of external panels was complete. I secured the hatch, coiled the lifeline meticulously, and returned to the internal corridor, aware that every step had been a test. Elias met me at the threshold, eyes wide, fully alert, and without words, we shared the understanding that Rule 6 had been a lifeline in every sense. The ocean remained vast, patient, pressing, yet the tether had allowed me to navigate without incident. I realized that rules like this weren't just for safety, they were the thin boundary separating survival from unseen, patient forces that monitored every misstep, every lapse in attention, every moment of hubris. Following Rule 6 wasn't optional, it was essential. As I finally returned to my bunk, exhausted but fully alert, the lessons of Rule 6 resonated in my mind. The emergency lifeline was more than a tool, it was a symbol of connection, awareness, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. The ocean outside pressed relentlessly against the walls, yet I felt tethered, grounded, capable of facing the next challenge. The previous rules, combined with this one, had taught me the fragile balance between action, observation, and survival, and the importance of respecting each precaution to the fullest. The modules were quiet now, yet the memory of the lifeline, taut and unyielding, would stay with me, a constant reminder of Rule 6's essential wisdom. Even after securing the lifeline and navigating the external modules, I couldn't shake the growing unease when I remembered Rule 7. Never acknowledge a shadow as your own. At first it seemed almost metaphorical, a caution against self-delusion, but the deeper truth was far more sinister. The shadows in the lab were unpredictable, moving independently of the lights, stretching across walls and panels in ways that defied logic. Earlier that night, as I passed a corridor lined with monitors, a dark form mimicked my movements exactly, always one step behind, sometimes faster. The instinct to acknowledge it, to reassure myself it was harmless, was overwhelming. But every fiber of my being screamed that even recognition could invite consequences I wasn't ready to face. The lab's metal walls reflected the dim emergency lights, creating multiple false echoes of movement. I moved cautiously, each step measured, avoiding eye contact with shapes that seemed to mirror me. It was almost impossible not to notice the shadows. They reacted to light, to sound, to pressure, and yet they were not bound by any law I understood. I remembered Hale's quiet admonishments. Do not make them part of yourself. Do not affirm their existence as yours. Those words now resonated in my mind with terrifying clarity. Even the simplest nod, the tiniest gesture of recognition, could allow these shadows a foothold, a bridge into awareness, a link that I might not survive. Earlier that shift, I had passed Elias, and for a fleeting second, I thought his elongated shadow might be mine. My pulse quickened, a mix of fear and disbelief, but I forced myself to ignore it. I could feel the presence of something patient, something ancient, pressing from the edges of perception, waiting for me to falter. The shadows weren't just visual phenomena, they were responsive, aware, almost sentient. Every time I almost acknowledged one as belonging to me, a shiver ran down my spine. Rule 7 wasn't simply about fear. It was about preserving the fragile barrier between our consciousness and whatever existed in the gaps, the spaces, the ocean and the lab created between certainty and the unknown. As I moved deeper into the lab, the shadows became bolder, They stretched across the ceiling, pooled in corners, and sometimes appeared behind me when I knew no light could cast them there. My instinct was to glance back, to confront them, to assert my reality. But I remembered Rule 7. Even recognition could be a tether, allowing something to attach itself to my awareness, to mimic me more perfectly, and perhaps replace me in ways I couldn't understand. My heart raced, every breath shallow, as I navigated the corridor, careful to focus only on tangible objects, instruments, and the life-sustaining lights that still blinked weakly above me. I tried to keep a logical mindset, convincing myself these were optical illusions, tricks of light reflecting in curved metal panels. Yet, deep down, I knew the shadows were not passive. They moved with intent, patience, and awareness, waiting for any hint of acknowledgement, any hesitation, any recognition that could invite interaction. Rule 7 had become a mantra in my head, silently repeated with every step, every turn, every glance toward a flicker of darkness. The corridor seemed to elongate unnaturally, as though the shadows themselves were stretching the space, testing my resolve, examining my adherence to the rules that kept me alive. At one point, I paused near a junction of two hallways, where the shadows pooled unnaturally thick. A dark form stretched along the wall, perfectly synchronized with my posture and breathing. I forced myself to avert my gaze, focusing instead on the console panel at my side. The instinct to turn and acknowledge it nearly overwhelmed me. The presence seemed almost coaxing, patient, insistent, but I gripped the edge of the panel tightly, repeating Rule 7 silently, reminding myself that recognition could allow the shadows an entry into the mind. I had learned from experience that hesitation, curiosity, or panic were the exact triggers the shadows waited for, and this rule was a boundary, a lifeline between stability and disaster. I continued through the corridor, careful not to cast light directly toward any darkened corners. Shadows flickered, stretched, and twisted, yet I forced my perception to treat them as separate from me, as nothing more than a trick of geometry and light. The effort was exhausting. Every movement required hyper-awareness, every step weighed with the possibility of misperception. I felt my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling slightly, despite my deliberate pace. Each shadow that mirrored a movement, each elongated form at the edge of vision, reminded me that Rule 7 wasn't a suggestion, it was a safeguard, protecting the mind from forces that were not human, from patterns that observed, learned, and waited. By the time I reached the central lab module, the shadows had thickened along the walls, pooling in areas where no light should reach. I could hear the faint hum of machinery, almost in harmony with my heartbeat, amplifying the sense of being observed. I traced every step meticulously, avoiding any interaction or acknowledgement, repeating Rule 7 silently. The air felt heavier, charged with tension, as though the shadows themselves weighed on the atmosphere. I realized fully that the rule was about more than awareness. It was about refusal, about denying an entry point to a force that could only exist if I allowed it to interact with me knowingly. Recognition, even subconscious, was permission. Elias eventually appeared at the far end of the module, eyes wide and fully awake, a silent reassurance that I was not entirely alone. His presence allowed me to maintain some focus, some tether to reality. We moved together cautiously, making adjustments to the sensors and equipment, while maintaining strict adherence to Rule 7. The shadows continued to stretch and pool, yet we treated them as inert, refusing to acknowledge their movements as anything other than coincidence. The psychological discipline required was immense, yet every moment of restraint reinforced the fragile barrier between conscious perception and the unknown lurking in the lab's corners. As my shift continued, I reflected on the cumulative weight of the rules. Rule 7, like the previous 6, demanded vigilance, restraint, and constant attention. Even a small slip, a glance too long, a pause too heavy, a recognition whispered in thought, could allow a shadow a foothold. By consciously denying the shadows any acknowledgement, I maintained both psychological and environmental stability. The corridors, walls, and lab modules remained intact, yet the shadows lingered at the edges, patient, silent, testing me continuously. The practice of avoiding acknowledgement had become second nature, a lifeline in the quiet terror of isolation, reminding me that survival was as much about discipline as endurance. By the end of the night cycle, I returned to my bunk, heart still racing, muscles tight with tension. Rule 7 had taught me a lesson harsher than any physical trial. The mind could be as vulnerable as the body, and forces beyond comprehension existed in the spaces between conscious observation and passive recognition. Elias nodded as I entered, a quiet acknowledgement of shared survival, yet neither of us spoke of the shadows. The lesson was ingrained. The presence of darkness, the reflective shadows, and the patient forms that mimicked reality were to be ignored entirely. Acknowledgement could cost more than life. It could cost awareness itself, leaving only an empty shell. Even after navigating the shadows of Rule 7, I felt a deep, visceral unease, as I reminded myself of Rule 8. Never remove your helmet inside the deep-sea passageways. The rule seemed basic at first glance, a precaution against crushing pressure or contamination. But I had begun to realize its true significance. The passageways were claustrophobic and alive with the faint pulse of the ocean's depth pressing against the steel walls. Removing the helmet wasn't just a matter of physical danger. It was about exposing the mind and body to the subtle, almost sentient presence that lingered in the water, in the air, and in the shadows. The first time I'd seen a colleague remove their helmet during a minor inspection, the consequences had been immediate, terrifying, and unexplainable. I walked cautiously down the narrow corridors, the hum of the lab's machinery echoing off the walls. Each step was deliberate, my gloved hands tracing the ridges of the wall to ground myself. I could feel the pressure outside, not just through the thick steel, but in the subtle vibrations that traveled through the floors and walls. My helmet kept my senses confined, focused, yet alert. I thought of the emergency drills and the warnings we'd all been given. One lapse, one temptation to breathe freely or feel the air outside the protective suit, and the environment would take advantage. It was as if the passageways themselves were aware, listening, testing for moments of vulnerability, and the helmet was the boundary that kept us tethered to safety and consciousness. Earlier that shift, I had noticed faint, almost imperceptible distortions in the air surrounding a junction between two modules. The light refracted oddly, shadows bent unnaturally, and the space seemed to stretch. The instinct to remove the helmet, to see more clearly, to feel more present, was strong, a deceptive pull that my rational mind had to resist. I gripped the edges of the helmet, instinctively, reassuring myself that Rule 8 was more than protocol. It was the barrier between understanding the world as it should be and falling into a perception warped by forces I couldn't begin to name. Each breath I took inside the helmet reminded me of its importance, the fragile line it maintained between life and potential disappearance. As I moved deeper into the passageways, the isolation became more acute. The corridors twisted in ways that defied orientation, forcing me to rely on instruments rather than sight alone. Occasionally, I caught reflections in the visors of my helmet, dark, elongated forms that seemed to move independently, mirroring the shapes Rule 7 had warned me to ignore. I clenched my jaw and adjusted the helmet, remembering that it was both physical protection and psychological shield. Without it, the mind was vulnerable, open to hallucinations, or worse, interactions with the unknown that lurked in the pressure and darkness outside the protective glass. Rule 8 had never felt so alive, so insistent. As I walked through the hum of the deep-sea environment, the passageways were silent, except for the distant mechanical hum, yet the pressure seemed to amplify every creak, every vibration. Shadows pooled in the corners of my vision, and I could feel them watching, testing, waiting for me to falter. My thoughts drifted to the mistakes of those who had ignored the rule, whose helmets had been removed for a brief lapse or a curious experiment. They had returned altered, hollow, sometimes incoherent, whispering of whispers and pressures no one outside the lab could ever imagine. I forced myself to focus on my instruments, every movement deliberate, ensuring that the helmet remained secured, the seal intact, and my awareness sharp. When I approached the junction leading to the external maintenance module, the faint lighting created unnatural reflections, doubling and tripling the shadows along the walls. My pulse quickened as I noticed a slight distortion in the water beyond the glass, subtle currents that seemed to move with awareness rather than natural flow. I gripped the edges of my helmet again, remembering Rule 8, and whispered to myself that any removal, even for a second, could allow the environment to influence the mind. It wasn't just about pressure, it was about isolation, exposure, and leaving the mind unshielded in a domain where the ocean itself seemed to observe, respond, and react. I began the routine inspection of the module's external sensors. My hands, gloved and steady, traced the familiar patterns on the control panels. The pressure outside was immense, palpable through the thick steel and reinforced glass. I felt the subtle vibrations traveling through the hull, and I imagined them as communication, deliberate and waiting for a crack in my discipline. The helmet kept me connected to the internal environment, filtered every sensory input, and ensured my mind remained anchored. Without it, the passageways became a conduit for something ancient, patient, and capable of exploiting any lapse in judgment or attention. The rule was not an arbitrary restriction, it was the difference between comprehension and disorientation, survival and disappearance. I thought of Elias, moving ahead in another section, fully armored, helmet secure, eyes alert. The presence of another person anchored me somewhat, yet the corridors remained alive, with pressure and subtle observation. I kept my visor clear, checking instruments, monitoring currents, and listening to the faint resonance in the walls. Shadows danced along the floor in elongated, unnatural forms, reacting as though aware of my every motion. Every step reinforced Rule 8, reminding me that the helmet was both physical and psychological armor, a boundary between perception shaped by reality and perception invaded by unknown forces, lurking in the pressurized water. Hours passed as I performed the external module checks. The hum of machinery, the faint vibrations through the hull, and the subtle movement of shadows all demanded constant vigilance. My hands grew tired, but I resisted any temptation to loosen the helmet, to adjust it casually, to feel a sense of freedom. The rule's insistence echoed in my mind: never remove it inside the passageways. Even the slightest lapse could allow influence to penetrate, an imperceptible encroachment that would distort judgment, awareness, and perhaps identity. The helmet was a shield, yes, but also a tether to reality, keeping the mind anchored while the environment tested every boundary. Finally, after completing the external inspection and documenting anomalies, I returned to the safer internal modules. The corridor lights flickered faintly, and shadows retreated slightly, yet their presence was undeniable. I breathed deeply within the secured helmet, feeling the weight and the security it provided. Rule 8 had guided my actions, prevented exposure, and preserved not just my physical safety, but my mental clarity. The ocean pressed relentlessly outside, patient, observant, but I was tethered, anchored by protocol, by discipline, and by the protective layer that separated me from forces I could barely begin to comprehend. The lesson was clear: no matter the fatigue, curiosity, or perceived safety, the helmet remained inviolable. After completing the external inspection under Rule 8, an uneasy tension gripped me as I reminded myself of Rule 9. Never trust the readings from sensors that flicker during silence. It was a rule I had once considered overly cautious, a technical safeguard against misinterpretation, but I had begun to understand the deeper, more insidious truth. The lab was silent, eerily, oppressively silent, and in that quiet, even the smallest flicker of a sensor light could signify far more than a mechanical anomaly. It was as though the ocean, the lab, and some unseen presence conspired to distort perception, offering false readings to manipulate or mislead anyone who dared interpret them. The weight of this knowledge pressed on me as I approached the central monitoring console, every instinct screaming caution, The corridor lights dimmed in irregular pulses, shadows stretching along walls and floors like liquid fingers, and I felt the unmistakable hum of something beyond machinery, something patient and aware. The sensors before me twitched and flickered intermittently, their screens alternately alive and blank. I reminded myself that Rule 9 existed precisely for these moments, a warning that any hasty action based on incomplete or distorted data could invite disaster. I took a deep breath and resisted the temptation to immediately adjust the readings or act on them, instead documenting each flicker, each anomaly with meticulous care. The ocean's presence pressed on the hull, echoing faintly in every vibration, reinforcing the rule's subtle but essential guidance. Earlier, I had seen a small pattern emerge on the depth sensors, a rhythmic pulse that seemed too deliberate to be mechanical. My heart raced as I realized that even though the data suggested a minor fluctuation, the repetition felt like a signal. Was it the ocean itself communicating, or something else entirely, observing my reaction to these flickers? I forced myself to step back, reminding myself silently of Rule 9, and considered the previous incidents where trusting the sensors had led to inexplicable consequences. Crew members had misinterpreted subtle flickers and disappeared into modules, corridors, or observation chambers, never returning with coherent explanations. The rule existed to prevent such misjudgments, a thin boundary between discernment and fatal curiosity. As I traced the anomalies across multiple consoles, I noticed the flickers synchronized in a way that suggested intelligence rather than error. Shadows pooled near the edges of the panels, shifting subtly as if responding to my scrutiny. Each flicker provoked an instinct to react, to adjust pressure or recalibrate sensors, but I resisted. I reminded myself that Rule 9 demanded patience, observation, and skepticism. The readings could deceive, the silence could amplify fear, and any attempt to act prematurely could amplify danger. The distinction between mechanical failure and deliberate manipulation by forces unseen was almost imperceptible, yet crucial. I had to remain vigilant, grounded, and disciplined to survive. I glanced toward the observation chamber, still faintly lit in the distance. Shadows pooled within it, as if aware of my focus, stretching and coiling in ways that defied natural geometry. The sensor's flickers seemed to echo those shapes, a subtle visual distortion that made me question whether the readings were purely data or an extension of the environment itself, testing my response. Rule 9 had never felt more alive, more pressing. I realized that trusting without verification, acting without caution, could allow something patient and observant to exploit the smallest lapse in judgment. The silence around me was thick, heavy, and I felt as though each flicker whispered warnings, reminders, or tests of my adherence to the rule. Hours passed in tense observation, my eyes flicking from panel to panel, tracing every anomaly, documenting patterns, and resisting the urge to intervene prematurely. The lab's hum, the gentle vibration of machinery, and the subtle shift of shadows created a rhythm that felt almost sentient. I reminded myself that Rule 9 was not merely a technical guideline, it was a psychological anchor, a method of keeping sanity and caution intertwined. Every flicker was a test, every silence amplified risk, and my survival depended entirely on my ability to remain disciplined, observant, and skeptical. The boundaries between perception and reality blurred, yet I clung to the rule like a lifeline in the oppressive deep-sea isolation. At one point, a faint red light flickered on a pressure sensor, then disappeared. I felt a jolt of instinctive panic, a sudden desire to reset the system immediately, but I clenched my fists, grounding myself. Rule 9 reminded me that the flicker itself could be a trap, a lure, or a test from forces beyond the lab's understanding. I carefully noted the time, duration, and pattern of the flicker, resisting any immediate adjustment. Shadows danced along the walls as though reacting to my restraint, stretching into corners and across consoles, but I ignored them entirely. The principle of the rule became crystal clear. Survival demanded that I observe without trusting, react without impulse, and navigate the unknown with caution and patience. The tension escalated as I moved from console to console, each flicker more pronounced than the last, each shadow more deliberate in its placement. My pulse quickened with every anomaly, yet I reminded myself that acting too quickly could be catastrophic. The ocean's weight pressed through the walls, the lab's metal bones vibrating with imperceptible shifts, and the shadows seemed to twist in rhythm with my heartbeat. I had come to understand that the flickers weren't random. They were tests, deliberate manipulations by an environment or force beyond comprehension, and Rule 9 existed to guide the cautious, the observant, and the disciplined through these trials. Even a single moment of trust could have irreversible consequences. By the end of the night shift, I had compiled extensive notes on each flicker, each anomaly, and each visual distortion. The silence remained oppressive, yet my awareness was sharper than ever. The shadows had not moved closer, and the readings, while still flickering intermittently, revealed no immediate danger, but the lesson had been seared into my consciousness. Rule 9 demanded patience, vigilance, and unwavering skepticism. The ocean outside pressed against the lab like a living presence, and I understood fully that trusting too easily, reacting impulsively, or misinterpreting the subtle signals of the deep could invite consequences that the rules had long sought to prevent. The boundaries between awareness, perception, and survival were fragile, yet adherence to the rule had preserved both. I returned to my bunk, heart still pounding, muscles tense, reflecting on the lessons of Rule 9. The flickering sensors, the silence, the shadows, and the oppressive pressure had tested every ounce of discipline and mental fortitude I possessed. The rule was not merely about technology, it was about survival, perception, and respect for the environment and forces beyond comprehension. By observing without trusting, I maintained a fragile equilibrium, a tether to reality and sanity in the vast oppressive isolation of the deep-sea lab. The lesson of Rule 9 would stay with me, a reminder that appearances could deceive, silence could amplify danger, and patience was as essential as air or steel in this unforgiving environment. After the tense hours following Rule 9, I reminded myself with a shiver of dread. Rule 10: never respond to a voice that comes from an empty module. At first it had seemed like common sense, a precaution against hallucinations or equipment malfunctions. But I had learned that the rule's true weight extended far beyond logic. The lab's modules, suspended in total darkness beyond reinforced glass, were eerily alive. Sounds traveled through the metal, the water, and the pressure, creating echoes and resonances that seemed intentional. The first time I had hesitated near a seemingly empty module, I heard my name called in a whisper, soft, familiar, and impossibly close. Yet when I peeked inside, no one was there. That moment was the moment Rule 10 began to feel like survival incarnate. I paused at the junction between the central lab and the observation module, gripping the handrails tightly. Shadows pooled in corners, flickering along the edges of my vision, and the faint hum of machinery seemed to pulse in sync with the whispers I imagined. I reminded myself of Rule 10 and forced every sense to anchor in the tangible. The lights above, the steady hum of compressors, the faint vibration beneath my boots. The voice had been soft but insistent, as if coaxing me to step closer, to answer, to interact. And in the silence of the deep-sea lab, silence that seemed alive and attentive, every instinct screamed to obey. That was the danger. The ocean and the lab had a way of amplifying longing, loneliness, and curiosity, turning them against you. Earlier in the shift, I had stopped by an empty storage module to check external sensors. The temperature gauges flickered slightly, and then I heard it, a low, deliberate whisper calling my name. My pulse jumped, my breathing hitched, but I forced myself to remain silent and continue my work. The voice was patient, coaxing, and almost human, perfectly mimicking tone, cadence, even inflection. I clenched my fists, repeating Rule 10 silently, refusing to answer, refusing to acknowledge it. The shadows along the corridor walls seemed to lean closer, stretching unnaturally toward the source, and I felt a cold, patient intelligence behind the whisper, testing my discipline, measuring my adherence to the rules that had become my lifeline. I thought of Elias in the adjacent module, unaware of the whisper, yet fully immersed in his own checks. The presence of another person anchored me slightly, yet I could feel the pull, the temptation to respond, to call back in defiance or curiosity. The voice was subtle, persistent, threading itself through the ambient hum of machinery, exploiting the isolation, and preying on the mind's natural need for interaction. Rule 10 existed to sever that instinct, to prevent the unknown from establishing a bridge between perception and reality. Every step I took, every movement of my hands over consoles, reinforced the discipline needed to survive in the oppressive, silent depths. I moved cautiously toward the observation module, sensors in hand, documenting anomalies, while carefully ignoring the occasional echo of that whisper. The shadows seemed alive now, moving independently of light, stretching across walls in ways that defied physics. Every instinct screamed to investigate, yet I held fast, reminding myself silently of Rule 10. The ocean pressed constantly against the hull, and I could feel its presence through every vibration and every subtle pulse in the metal floor. Isolation amplified the danger, making the rule not just practical but essential, a boundary that separated controlled observation from exposure to forces that thrived on curiosity and inattention. At one junction, the whisper escalated, forming complete words, phrases, sentences that mimicked the cadence of human speech perfectly. "Come here, help me," it said, low and intimate, yet entirely empty in origin. My mind wanted to respond, to reassure, to communicate, but the rule held me steady. Rule 10 reminded me that acknowledging, replying, or approaching the source could allow the voice to manipulate the senses, infiltrate thoughts, and twist reality into something unrecognizable. The shadows shifted with a patience that felt sentient, aware of my restraint, and I realized fully that this rule was as much psychological as it was procedural, a defense against forces that could exploit emotional weakness in isolation. I focused on my instruments, meticulously noting sensor anomalies, writing down each flicker of light, each minor fluctuation in pressure, while refusing to look directly at empty modules. The whisper persisted, soft but insistent, threading through the corridor like liquid intent. The air inside my helmet seemed heavier, as if compressing around my thoughts. I repeated Rule 10 silently, grounding myself in the tangible, the lights, the steel walls, the hum of machinery. Any lapse, an answered whisper, a glance too long, a hesitant step toward the source, could give it a foothold, an entry point into the mind. Survival depended entirely on strict adherence, vigilance, and restraint. Hours stretched as I continued my work, documenting anomalies in other modules, while ignoring the whispers that flitted along the edges of hearing. Shadows elongated, twisted, and sometimes seemed to move in concert with the voice, reinforcing the connection between perception and danger. I felt my nerves fraying under the constant pressure and the persistent, patient voice that sought interaction. The ocean beyond the glass was silent, yet I imagined it listening, responding, and observing my restraint. Rule 10 became a lifeline, a psychological anchor that tethered my awareness to reality, ensuring that no unseen force could exploit hesitation, loneliness, or curiosity to invade consciousness. When Elias eventually returned to my side, I was tense but steady. We continued checks on modules together, coordinating actions, sharing observations, yet neither of us acknowledged the whisper. The presence lingered, patient, silent in the corners, but its power diminished when met with discipline and strict adherence to the rules. I realized that Rule 10, like the previous 9, wasn't optional. It wasn't just protocol, it was a survival mechanism, a boundary drawn between the mind's stability and the unknown lurking in the pressurized depths. Any interaction could have catastrophic consequences, yet careful observation, restraint, and partnership preserved both mental clarity and safety. By the end of the shift, the whispers had receded slightly, yet their memory remained vivid. Every flicker, shadow, and faint echo reinforced the importance of Rule 10. The deep-sea lab, the oppressive pressure, and the silence beyond the reinforced walls were alive in ways I could not fully explain. Rule 10 had guided me through the psychological minefield of auditory manipulation, preserving both my focus and sanity. The ocean outside pressed relentlessly against the hull, patient and observant, yet I had survived this trial through strict adherence, conscious restraint, and an unflinching refusal to engage with the empty voices that sought to draw me into the unknown. Even after enduring the terrors of rules 1 through 10, a creeping dread filled me as I whispered to myself, Rule 11. Never question the last rule, for it is the one nobody survives. It was almost laughable at first, the idea of a final rule so ominous that it promised death simply by curiosity. Yet, after all I had witnessed, the shadows, the flickering sensors, the empty voices, the patient pressure of the ocean outside, I knew there was no room for levity. The lab had a rhythm now, a pulse beneath the metal floors, and I could feel it watching, testing, calculating how far I would push before the inevitable. Rule 11 had always existed in the periphery of my mind, the final boundary I dared not cross, a secret whispered between surviving researchers who had seen what the abyss did to those who defied it. I walked toward the central observation module, gripping the rail tightly, and felt the deep vibrations underfoot shift, almost like a heartbeat. The air in my helmet seemed heavier, charged with a silent intelligence pressing against my thoughts. Every previous rule led to this moment. The lifeline had kept me tethered, the helmet had preserved my mind, shadows and whispers had tested my discipline, and the flickering sensors had honed my patience and skepticism. Now the culmination of all rules loomed before me, unspoken yet present in every corridor, every corner, every subtle shift of light and shadow. I dared not ask why or probe for understanding. Rule 11 existed precisely to forbid that, and its consequences were absolute. Earlier, as I approached the module, I felt a tug, not physical but mental, pressing against the edges of my perception. I caught sight of my own shadow stretching along the floor, impossibly long and distorted, seeming to merge with another darker shape that didn't belong to me. The whisper of a familiar voice, not quite my own, brushed against my thoughts. I reminded myself of Rule 11, repeating it silently, as though chanting a mantra. Never question it, never seek to understand beyond obedience. The rule was the last barrier, a line drawn in the consciousness that separated those who survived from those who disappeared, altered or ceased entirely. I could feel the weight of it in the air, as if the ocean itself leaned closer, listening, waiting for even a fraction of doubt to break me. The observation module's lights flickered faintly, casting elongated shadows that seemed to twist independently of the walls and equipment. The hum of the machinery, once comforting, now felt like the lab's pulse, alive, intentional, almost sentient. I reminded myself that Rule 11 demanded restraint, demanded silence and curiosity, and above all demanded obedience without question. Any attempt to probe, to record, to understand what the last rule entailed, could summon consequences not even the ocean or the lab itself could explain. I had seen colleagues push boundaries in minor ways with other rules, sometimes surviving, sometimes not, but the final rule was different. It required absolute submission, a complete surrender of curiosity and speculation, a recognition that survival depended entirely on respect for the unknown. As I moved toward the console that monitored the external modules, the shadows seemed to thicken, pooling in corners where no light could reach. Each flicker of a sensor and each distorted reflection reminded me of every previous trial, every test of patience, restraint, and awareness. The whispers of empty modules were gone now, replaced by silence so deep that it felt like a presence, pressing, patient, and aware. I focused on the tangible pressure readings, instrument hum, steady handrails, but every fiber of my being screamed that something watched, something ancient and patient, waiting to judge every thought, every hesitation. Rule 11 was not merely a guideline, it was a gatekeeper, an ultimate measure of whether my discipline and adherence would outlast the abyss surrounding us. I paused briefly at the threshold of the last module, staring into the dimly lit interior. It seemed ordinary at first glance, yet every instinct, every memory of previous events, whispered caution. The metallic walls reflected my helmeted face, but the reflection was subtly wrong, slightly delayed, slightly distorted, as if observing me in a way my own eyes could not comprehend. I pressed my palms against the railing, and recited Rule 11 silently, allowing its weight to ground me. The temptation to question, to lean forward, to seek understanding, to peek beyond protocol, rose and fell like tides, but I resisted, knowing that any deviation from absolute obedience could render the previous 10 rules meaningless. Rule 11 was the boundary between life, comprehension, and the unknown abyss that surrounded the lab, pressing silently against reinforced steel and fragile human awareness. The hum of machinery shifted, almost like it was breathing in sync with my own heartbeat. Shadows along the walls lengthened and intertwined, but I refused to acknowledge them, recalling Rule 7 and Rule 10 as reinforcement. The final rule, like an invisible wall, demanded obedience beyond thought. My mind strained against the curiosity that always whispered at the edges. What is the last rule? What happens if I question it? The answer, I knew instinctively, was never meant to be known. Survival in this environment, under miles of ocean pressure, among shadows, whispers, flickers, and solitude, demanded surrender. Rule 11 wasn't just the last rule, it was a law imposed by the environment itself, enforced by the weight of the unknown, the patient, sentient presence of the ocean, and the isolation that wrapped every corridor, panel, and observation deck. I continued cautiously, documenting readings, checking life support panels, and adjusting instruments, all while maintaining strict adherence to every preceding rule. The silence was oppressive, yet I relied on the discipline that had carried me through 10 prior trials. Rule 11 remained unspoken in action, its presence enforced in every choice I made, every glance I avoided, every shadow I ignored. I understood fully that the last rule was a culmination, a measure of everything I had learned and endured. To question it, even mentally, was to invite forces that existed in the fissures of perception and the spaces between reinforced steel and the ocean's crushing weight. The rule was absolute, a final test that transcended logic and physics, rooted in survival and respect for forces beyond human comprehension. By the end of the cycle, I had completed all tasks, maintained silence and curiosity, and followed Rule 11 to the letter. The ocean pressed relentlessly, the shadows retreated, and the modules hummed with the faint rhythm of stability restored. I leaned against the railing, exhausted yet alert, acutely aware of the presence lurking just beyond perception. Rule 11 had protected me, had demanded discipline beyond explanation, and had preserved my awareness in the oppressive isolation of the deep. The lessons of all 11 rules converged in that moment. Life beneath the ocean was not won by strength or knowledge alone, but by adherence, restraint, and absolute obedience to boundaries whose nature we might never fully understand. I returned to my bunk, heart pounding, muscles trembling, mind stretched to its limits. The weight of the ocean outside, the patient, observing shadows, the whispers that no longer spoke, all were reminders that Rule 11 was final, unyielding, and impossible to question. I lay awake, aware that every previous rule had prepared me for this moment, yet this final boundary remained inscrutable, unbroken, and absolute. The deep sea lab, suspended in isolation, reminded me that survival depended not on curiosity, but on the unwavering obedience that had carried me through one trial after another. I dared not wonder, dared not question, for I understood instinctively that Rule 11, the last rule, was indeed the one nobody survives, at least if defied. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.